It is great to see everyone here. So appreciate you guys being here with us, and welcome everyone who is joining us online and in our other campuses. We're glad you guys are here as well. I want to begin with asking you a question. What is the craziest thing that you have ever done for love? Anybody done anything crazy for, no? All right. So I do stuff crazy for love all the time. I used to be kind of in charge of my life. At least, I think I was. And then I got married, and then I have two daughters. And somewhere along the way, all the wheels came off, and now I just think I'm in charge of stuff when actually I'm just getting all the time. So in that, I was thinking about all the crazy things that I do for love. For example, because a lot of the things that we do aren't efficient, and they aren't like the fastest way to get things done. I end up Ubering my wife to work all the time. I drop her off right at the front door. It makes no logical sense because we could both, kill two birds at one stone. I could be going in one direction, she could be going the other. We do this at the grocery store. We go to the grocery store together because she likes to be together. And so all kinds of things we do. I'm an Uber Eats driver for my daughter. She calls and says, "Hey, Dad, I need some lunch at work." And so I have nothing else to do, so I just take her lunch to her work. And so I find myself doing all these things that make no sense, all for love. And I assume that you guys have done crazy things for love as well. You've done things that you wouldn't normally do, things that aren't efficient, things that don't make total sense, all for the sake of love. And so when I begin to think about this, I know a lot of us will do really, really crazy things for love, but I want to suggest to you that I think a lot of people do even crazier things when we are afraid that we will not be loved. I think that we do crazier things when we are afraid that we will be unloved. And so as I've been thinking about this over the last few weeks, kind of preparing for Easter, I did something real simple. I just took a piece of paper out and I drew on the paper, because I'm a pastor and I've been in this a long time. I just drew a picture of the cross, and I decided to think about, what does the cross mean to me? What does the cross mean to me? Now, because I'm a pastor, obviously I have a little bit of advantage. I've done this before, but what I found is that over the years, I've become really focused on the resurrection, and rightly so. I grew up most of my life thinking about the cross, the sacrifice of Jesus. I taught a lot on that, and probably in the last 7 or 8, 9, 10 years, I really had to come to grips with, what does the resurrection mean to me? What does it mean? And so I began to think about what the resurrected life mean. What does the resurrected life mean in the real world, in this real time, and how do I learn how to live in that? And I've tried to, a lot of our Easters have focused on that. And what I think we have to realize, at least as I want to sort of press in over the next couple of weeks together, is to recognize that the resurrected life is only possible because of the crucifixion. If there is no cross, there is no resurrection, right? If there is no death, there is no life redeemed. And we talked about this a little bit last week, that a lot of us, we get to this place where we're trying to get God to do what we want him to do, and what he's asking us to do is to stop keeping these patterns and these desires and these demands on life support and keep giving them CPR, but to really let them die so that something new can be rebirthed out of them. And I think that's part of why I want us to sit and think about the cross. In fact, the cross is really a bizarre thing if we really consider it. Now, I was reading this morning in my quiet time in Psalm chapter 14 this past week. Sometimes when I get really in a hurry or really stressed, I got a lot of things kind of happening around. And so a lot of times I'll get up in the morning and I'm trying to jump, get to work early and get some things done. I don't know if you ever do that. And what I have to discipline myself to do is to not run ahead. So because a lot of my work involves reading the Bible, I'll end up reading the Bible to try to get my work done. And so I have to see my first part is to read the Bible in order to commune with and to relate to and to walk with God, as my Lord, and to live in my relationship with him. And so part of the discipline that I do a lot of times in that is to read through the Psalms very slowly. Because a lot of times the Psalms, they're not like, oh, here's a great quote here. It's just, you have to just kind of read and immerse yourself and just sort of let yourself think about it. And so I've been in Psalm 12 and Psalm 13 and Psalm 14 for the last 5 or 6 days. And Psalm 14 is probably familiar when it says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. but they are corrupt, their deeds are evil, and no one who does good. And then you get down to the very end of the book, and it says that, oh, that the salvation of God would come from Israel, and that we will be glad when the Lord restores the fortunes of his people. We will be glad when the Lord restores the fortunes of his people. I'm like, amen to that, right? And then I began to think about, if you were looking for that, if you were looking for God to restore the fortunes of his people, if that was what your eyes were set on, what would you be expecting? What would you be expecting him to do? The question that I get all the time, especially through the pandemic and through what we've been through, is, Mike, why does God allow this? Why the suffering? Why are things hard? Why does he allow all these things into our lives? You know why we ask those questions? Because we do not expect the thing that God actually did. We are looking for all kinds of other things. We're looking for God to save us from hard things or difficult things or suffering. We're looking for God to save us from all those things. In fact, this is exactly how Paul would write about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, as he's writing this letter to a bunch of Greek-thinking people who learn how to follow Jesus, but they're fundamentally Greek. They fundamentally operate by logic. They fundamentally think that logic and brains and reason are the highest values. And here's what Paul writes to them. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. It is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. So we immediately see on the either side of this cross, we see two categories. We have those who are perishing, and then we have those who are being saved. And we immediately have to put ourselves in one of those categories. We have to think, which side of this am I on? Perishing, what does that mean? A lot of folks, when we think, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute, but a lot of folks, when we think about perishing, we always think about hell and sort of the end result of after our lives. And what I would say to you, although I believe that's true, what I would say to you is that just as the kingdom of God, the way that Jesus has come to bring the gospel to us, it matters here and now, our perishing matters here and now as well. There's something that we fundamentally operate in that is leading us in a trajectory towards where our eternities will be determined. It's all, everything, the moments, what we're living in now matter. And so I want for us to consider this. What is it that God, so it says here that for those who are perishing, the cross is foolishness. It makes no sense. When we say, well, if God didn't save me from suffering or a hard time or the pandemic or an economic downfall or all, if he didn't save me from that, then what purpose is this? And it just seems like foolishness. But to those who are being saved, he says, it is the very power of God. There's a force in it. So what is it? When it says that to those who are being saved, my question would be, if it's not saving us from the hard things that we face in the world, what is he saving us from? What I think is that what God has come to save us from is really simple. He came to save us if we do crazy things for love, and we do even crazier things and more desperate things for the fear that we will be unloved. I think what he's saving us from is a life lived unloved. Now, I would write that down, and then we're going to consider it together, because I don't know how many of us would put ourselves in that category any more than how many people would put ourselves in this category over here. So I want us to think about what happens when we are unloved. What happens when we are unloved, and which category does it fit in? I sat down in my office, and the other thing too, I love the fact that it says that those who are being saved, this just continues that progress, that progression we've been talking about, that it says that we have been made perfect and are being made holy from the last series. And here we see this again, that he just says, for those of us who are living in this, who are experiencing this, in the moments as they come, this is the power of God that we have available to us. And it's all in the cross. It's all in the cross. So I sat down at my desk, and I did the only way I know how to do. I just sat down and I tried to write out some things and reflect on some things about what the cross means to me. It's an exercise I would commend to you. It's an exercise I would commend to sit down and say, what does the cross mean to me? And what you'll find is you'll have some words there. But what I would also submit to you is there's a whole lot. There's a depth that we have not even begun to explore. If we'll just stop and say, God, can you show me what your cross means to me. So I sat down with my pen and my piece of paper and my journal, as you can imagine. I just began to write some things out, so I want to just share this with you. And I just wrote down at the beginning, I took a picture, I took a marker and I drew the cross in the middle of my page. I just said, on the cross. And the first thing that popped in my mind is the cross is not a symbol. It's not a symbol. It is a symbol, but it's not a symbol, right? It's not just a symbol. It's a demonstration. It's a collapsing of things. It's a culmination of things. It's a collision of things. It's a compression of things. It was a crucifixion, make no mistake, that made possible the resurrection. It was a death, the death, that opened the way to life. The cross is a demonstration of ultimate love and ultimate brokenness. The worst of suffering, the worst of human suffering, the worst of human pain, the worst of human sorrow, the worst of humiliation, the worst of despair, the worst of shame, were all compressed in the cross. Everything that you have felt and we feel, the things that we're afraid of, were all compressed in that moment. In the cross resides the worst of what humans do to one another. Think about this. Think about what happens in our culture, right? You see human beings doing terrible things to other human beings, right? No? We see this everywhere. It's all over social media. It's all over the news. It's in our offices. It's in our families. It's everywhere. The things that we do to one another. In the cross resides the worst of what human beings do to one another. And it also holds the worst reasons for which we do it. Selling each other out. Preserving our own will or way or our own sense of power. Avoiding responsibility. Blaming other people. Indifference to those who live in the margins, to those who hold no power, to those whose lives don't affect ours. Indifference to mercy, indifference to grace, indifference to justice. The worst of humanity crosses, it literally crosses the glory of divinity. And what I want to remind us of, and we think about this, the cross wasn't just a thing that brought about a new religion, a new system of thinking. The cross was actually a real event in real time that happened to a real person. It was real Roman soldiers that hammered nails into a real Jewish carpenter. The execution on the hill serves as the epicenter of hope, as the culmination of events when the Creator would step into His creation to rescue and to redeem. For it was no mere criminal who hung between the two thieves on the cross in the middle. On that day and in that moment, it was God Himself on the cross. I want you to consider this. The implications on your life, and if what God has done and what He has said about what He has done is true for you, the implications are astounding, and the freedom that is promised to you is nearly unbelievable. So what is it on the cross? The cross saves us from living unloved. And what I think is that the cross is fundamentally a demonstration of love. That's what this is. The cross is just a demonstration of love. And what I would say is that human beings at the depths of who we are is we long for love. This is what we always want. This is what we're always pursuing. I think it's evident in the music that culture writes and has about love and about what it would be like and about all this. There's always this pursuit, this thing. And so the way I think about this is really simply, and this comes from the book of 1 John, when you try to think, okay, if the cross is the demonstration of God's love, what does this mean for us? It's foolishness to those of us who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, there's a power to it. So how do we reconcile this with other than it just being this nice, flighty thing that we go, oh, we just love everything, like we love pizza, I love you, I love them, I love that, I love this cause, I love that, but there's something else to it. If you remember a few years ago, I did a series on this and I defined love very specifically because I don't want us to think that love is some kind of like calligraphy and something floral that we paint with pastel colors and go, oh, that's what love is. It's roses and it's some greenery and it's really pretty. Love is gritty, it's tenacious, it's fierce. So I was thinking about this, how does love work? What does it do? And the definition that I use is love is a force. Love is a force that breathes worth and value into the soul of another person. So to receive love is to be valued. To receive love is to be just to have a deeper sense of worth and value and to come alive because of it. That's what love does. So then you have to sort of figure out, what is it then? What is it? What is this force? Where does it come from? In 1 John, I think this is the clearest picture of it, although there's a ton of places that we could talk about this from. 1 John 4 is a little letter that the Apostle John wrote in the back of your Bibles. 3 little letters. This is the first one, 1 John. He's talking about, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God. He's talking about this idea of source, which is very common in John's writing. Then in verse 8, he says this, whoever does not love does not know God, because, very simply, what? God is love. So I stop and I have to, okay, now we've got a definition. Love is this force that breathes worth and value into the soul, and God himself is love. Whoever does not know God, does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us, that he sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him, that something might happen from what he did that affects us and then causes us to come alive. Verse 10, this is love, not that we loved God, not that we said, we are first, but that he loved us. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us, and he sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. This is, again, we've been talking about the last few weeks, that we live as those who have been forgiven. So God's love for us is himself, him embodying something and then demonstrating it to us. And the way he did that is by coming and dying on a cross. This is the gospel. This is the gospel. Verse 15, if you skip down, it says, if anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, if anyone acknowledges that God is, that he did what he said he's going to do, God lives in him, in them, and they in God. There's this reconnecting, this reconciliation, this reuniting. I often talk about this. People will talk about John 14, that when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and they say, this is the verse that proves sort of logically that Jesus is the only way to heaven, which is not what Jesus said. It's not what he said. You've heard that probably a whole bunch of times. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Therefore, it proves he's the only way to heaven. That's not what he said. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to, anybody know? The Father, but through me. He was not restoring you to a place. He was restoring us to a relationship. He was drawing us back into a place, to a relationship for which we have been made. It is to the Father. And what he says is that when we acknowledge him, when we learn and we acknowledge who he is, that he lives in us and we live in him, that God the Father, there's this redwelling once again. This is all from these verses we're reading. In verse 16, it says, so in that when we acknowledge this, and acknowledge is not just a head nod, it's a yielding to. It's a yielding. It's like, okay, this is now going to rule everything else about me. Whoever acknowledges this. And so we know, and now we rely on this love that God has for us. What does it mean to rely on the love that God has for you? Because that's what salvation is. That now we rely on this love that he has for us. That's what salvation is. So what I would say is that salvation then saves us from living unloved. Are you tracking? So if we could keep going on. Romans 5, right? It says that while we were yet sinners, God demonstrated his love for us, that he came and he died for us. He demonstrated his love. 2 Corinthians 5:18 says all of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us this ministry of reconciliation. That God, this is the message, that God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting our sins against us. So you begin to see what's happening, right? In the cross, what God is doing is he is reconciling the world, you and me. He's reconciling us to himself. Here's what's so amazing. Think about what God is doing. We long for love. You would agree with that. I think most of your friends would agree with that. People who don't believe in much of anything say, oh yeah, of course we all want to be loved. We all feel the sense, we all feel this pull. We wouldn't write songs about it. We wouldn't do crazy things for it. We all want love. So if that's true, we all long for love, and God is love, what is it you really want? Right? You remember this from elementary school math. If A equals C equals B, right? It all goes together. So if we long for love and God is love, what do we long for? God. Every human being. So what is he reconciling? This is the beautiful part of the gospel. He is reconciling the thing that you long for with the thing that you were made for. All these are reconciled in the cross so that you don't have to live as unloved. And this is where I want us to kind of push. I wanted to give you a quick test to determine whether or not you live as unloved. What happens when you live as unloved? I think there are a couple things that mark us. When we live as unloved, we live with this chronic sense of insecurity. I don't know if anyone in here struggles with insecurity at all. Maybe I'm the only one. But it's a chronic sense of insecurity where we're constantly trying to figure out where we measure or stand or stack up with other people. It's a chronic sense of how am I doing? We usually end up comparing ourselves to other people. We usually end up competing with other people. We usually end up trying. All these things are products of living as unloved. The way I say this is this: in the absence of love, in the absence of being loved, attention serves as a cheap substitute. In the absence of love, attention serves as a very cheap substitute. And the problem is attention is readily available throughout almost every part of our lives. It is within your power most every single day to solve this sense. Well, wait just a second. For those of you who are watching, there's some Top Gun happening above us. It's kind of cool, actually. Y'all have a picture in your head, don't you? Yep. I'm not even gonna say it. It is within your power to solve. It is almost always within your power to solve the sense and the dis-ease of insecurity by mining for validation. You can almost find it anywhere. You can always find someone who will tell you what you want to hear or need to hear, or will respond to you in some way that's going to validate you in your insecurity. Social media has made this epidemic. And the dangerous thing for a lot of the next generation is this has just become the way in which we even call it likes. Because it's a way to validate that you do matter and you do. See, this is what I'm talking about, right? He says, so we've come to know and rely on the love that God has for us, or we rely on other things. When you rely on any other things, it is a mark of living as though you are unloved. In the absence of love, attention is a cheap substitute. I think this plays into the kind of houses we buy, the cars we drive, the clothes that we wear. Young men and women are oftentimes leveraging their bodies as objects of attention in the deficiency of being loved, of having a sense of wholeness, of someone actually breathing worth and value into you. And it's not arbitrary. It comes from the very source of love himself. It comes from God breathing worth and value. He's the only one who has the power with that kind of force. That kind of force. When I talk about a force, I'm not being benign. When God demonstrated his love on the cross, think about what happened. When Jesus breathed his last and he said, "It is finished," what happened? The force of love hit the world and the world shook. This isn't passive, benign stuff. This is the power of God. And so that's thing one. The second sort of marker or indicator, if you are prone to living as one who is unloved, is sort of hyper-responsibility. You have chronic insecurity on one half, you have hyper-responsibility. In other words, you just have to be in charge or in control of everything, because if you're not, you're afraid that no one's gonna do it the way it ought to be, and therefore it's gonna be, the whole world's gonna sort of tip off its axis. Anybody relate to that? If you don't, the person sitting beside you probably does, right? And here's the principle. In the absence of love, manipulation becomes a reliable option. On one hand, we know and rely on the love that God has for us. On the other thing, we rely on our capacity to get people to act in ways that we think they want to act, therefore bringing us some measure of validation in a million ways. Most of us would not consider ourselves manipulative, but we do it all the time. I go home, I say, oh, Julie, she's my wife. Oh, Julie, that was the worst message I've ever preached in my life. Now, if you know Julie, she's gonna go, yep, you're right. What am I looking for? That was the worst message. She says, oh, honey, no, that was the best. And you're going, you're like, oh, that's what I needed. And what are you doing? You're manipulating, you're setting things up, you're controlling, you're trying to figure out how to get this person to give you what you need to find validation. I'm not sure if you see yourself in this in any capacity, but I think this is really, really pervasive, more so than we think. And what's even worse is what a lot of us end up doing is that we start resolving, right? We start resolving how we're going to be different in this, how we're going to change this. What I want you to understand is when you live as unloved, there is one dominant governing force. Fear is what governs us when our lives, or when we live our lives as those who are unloved. Fear governs us when we live unloved. People think about this, and I hear this all the time. I've been writing on this a lot. I'm trying to work on something we're gonna be doing in the next few months. But this idea of love and hate, these sort of binary, these opposites, love and hate, that's not the way in the gospel that it's set up. The opposite of love in the gospel is not hate, it's fear. And fear is what drives almost everything else. It's what we live under without being loved. And it drives us. It drives us. The fear that we won't measure up, the fear that we won't be worthy, the fear that we won't have what we want, the fear we won't have what we deserve, the fear that other people will get away with things that we can't ourselves get away with. And this drives everything else. So, what a lot of us will start doing is going, okay, I got some habits I got to break, because none of us would consider ourselves attention-seeking, calculating, manipulative people, right? Probably not. They all go to some other church somewhere else, right? Not us. So we wouldn't identify with that. But our resolve then, when we sort of see this evidence in our lives, we just resolve that we're going to stop doing this. We just need to fix a habit or break a pattern or apologize for this or do that. We're going to try to figure out how to solve this problem. The problem is you don't need a solution. You need salvation. You need salvation. He didn't come to say, for those of us whose problems are being solved. He said, for those of us who are being saved. For those of us who are being saved. And when we think about this, a lot of us, we don't identify ourselves as perishing because we're asking the wrong questions. It's like if you ask someone who thinks they're about to drown, they say, well, I'm not going to drown because I can swim. Well, that's the wrong question, because if you're out in the middle of the ocean, it's not whether or not you can swim, it's how long can you swim. You are perishing and you don't even know it because there's nothing on the horizon coming to get you. So to talk about salvation looks like foolishness until you realize you actually are asking the wrong question. You're actually living under the wrong rule. And then you realize, oh my gosh, there's a whole other way for me to live. We need salvation. We need salvation. What happens to us to live as one who is unloved creates a void in your soul and your heart that is literally dying to be filled. And this deep longing, nagging sense, it just begins to pull everything around you towards it. This isn't just self-absorption. I've been thinking about this. We talk about people being self-absorbed. You're not self-absorbed. You're not absorbed by yourself. What happens is you become consumed or you become driven by a lack of self, by an emptiness there, by a void there. And you don't become self-absorbing. You actually become life-absorbing in that you suck life from everyone and everything else around you. And we do this in the smallest of ways. For some, it's overt and it's annoying and you don't have people around you because you've sucked the life out of everybody. But for a lot of us, it's far more subtle than that. We're subtly finding our identity in our relationships, in our success, or in how people think about us. And it's just very, very subtle. And sometimes the more successful you are, the easier things come for you, the more subtly you sort of step into this. And he has come to bring salvation so that we do not live in that way as unloved. John Mark Comer writes about this. He talks about having an egoic operating system or an egocentric operating system. He says, in this way of life, the primary motivation is what I need and what I want. The primary motive for our lives is what I need and what I want, and the drive is to both to get it and then to figure out how to preserve it. And he writes this. This is a quote. He says, this way is rooted in fear and grasping for control in a way that is antithetical to love. As long as we are run by ego and by fear, and then parenthetically, he says the ego is mostly an attempt to avoid our deepest fears. Whenever we are run by ego and fear, we will act in ways that dishonor and dehumanize those around us. The end result of living unloved comes at the expense of every relationship, every effort, and ultimately the death of our own souls. He continues, he says, what we need in our life, what we have to do, is we need for the people in our lives and we need for our life to go a certain way in order for us to be okay. And our foundation is super, super slippery. So the litmus test over here really has to do with our attention, how we pursue it, and how subtly we leverage our cleverness, our charm, or whatever to get what it is that we think that we want. And those fall firmly into that category. So what does God's love demonstrated to us mean, or what is it for? This is how I want to conclude. In the cross, make no mistake about it, God was reconciling the world. He was demonstrating his love, and he was reconciling the world to himself, not counting people's sins against them. Jesus came, right? Jesus did not come to bring a word, not the way we think that he does. A lot of people think that Jesus came with these cool sayings and they're going to put a fire emoji about what Jesus said. He didn't come to do that. Jesus did not come to give you a pep talk about things being better or how suffering fits. Jesus came to give his life, to seek and save that which was lost, to ransom the world, to be a ransom for the world in order to be reconciled to him. It was God that was on a cross, and the cross is the climax. It's the pinnacle of God's demonstration of love for us. If you want to know about God's love for you, you do not have to look any further than the cross. That's the way this is designed to work, and we just got to stop and spend some time thinking about, considering the fact that it was God on a cross. The Creator, God himself, stepped out of his glory. That's how it's worded. He stepped out of where he was. He entered into his creation. He wrapped himself in human flesh, and he took the very worst that humanity had to offer. He took all of it. He took our brokenness. He took our desperation. He took our shame, and he was literally the object. He became the object of every form of injustice, of every elevation of human arrogance, and the fullness of the evil of this world. He took all of that on. And then he sets himself up. He says, now he sits at the right hand of his Father in this mysterious way, how the God, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all work together. But he sits there, there's this picture. He sits there and he judges. He serves as the judge. And the reason that he has the authority to judge is not because he's morally superior to you and I, although that would be reason enough. But his authority to judge is the same authority that he has to forgive. The authority to judge is that he experienced the absolute worst of what we have, and he took it to the grave. That's what allows him to judge. That's what allows him to forgive. God on the cross absorbed the scourge of sin, absorbed your sin and my sin to make sure that we would be forgiven once and for all. He absorbed the scourge of sin, and he absorbed the wrath of perfect holiness, of perfect justice, and perfect righteousness. And his once and for all sacrifice forever removed that which separates us from him and from his love, saving us from living as those who are unloved. Now, let me be really clear. When you try to think about what it means to be loved, this isn't something that you agree with or disagree with. That's not how love works. Well, I agree with that. It doesn't matter. It's a demonstration of God's love for you, not whether you agree with it or not. It's what you're going to do with it. You don't earn this. You don't try to justify it to figure out how you're worthy. It's not even something that you reciprocate. A lot of us, this is how we live, right? We go, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna love this person, and then they're gonna love me, and then I'm gonna love this person, and they're gonna love me, and this is just how you go. And something all happens is that you just create one chronic cycle of codependency of each person trying to outlove the other person because something's missing. Love isn't something that I give to you in order to get you to do something back for me. Love is a force that breathes worth and value into the soul of another. And so, in other words, you don't just reciprocate it, you have to receive it. You have to receive it, you have to trust it so that you come to know and rely on the love, the governing force of love in your life, that you have worth and value that you do not need from this person because you have been given that from love himself. And when that happens and you receive that to your toes, you can offer yourself and your love to another person. And then their job is not to outlove you, but to receive and to trust. And we create a relational dependency, a relational interaction, and not an economic exchange. The cross is the invitation to come and to die, to exchange your life in Jesus' death in order to live the life that he's, to take the thing that you most long for and to reconcile it for the thing for which you have been made. People ask me all the time, say, Mike, they love reason, the logic. The gospel is the most illogical thing that I've ever come across, and at the same time, it's the most logical thing. There is nothing logical about love. There is nothing logical about it. It's loony. To try to think, let me understand the reason why God would do blah, 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 is just never gonna make sense. It's completely illogical. But it's also the most logical thing you can imagine. Because he said, oh, you're made for this, you long for this. So I'm gonna demonstrate it, and in my demonstration, I'm going to reconcile you and you and you to the thing for which you have been made and which you long for anyway. And it doesn't get any more logical than that, right? This requires us to return, to repent, to come back, to be reconciled to the relationship for which we have been made. And so we're gonna close and just celebrate that the cross provides a demonstration of God's love for you and a way for us to return to the Father. To return to the Father. And for some of you, I think the imagery is even more because you've been working so hard to try to fix or solve and not manipulate or not do the things you've always done. And it's just too much for you to carry. And he just invites you to put it there and to return to the Father, or maybe better yet, to run to the Father. Some of you, this is your first, you've never heard the gospel like this, you've never considered it like this, and what you do is you just open your hands up and say, God, I wanna know, I wanna trust, and I wanna receive this. And just like that, he's like, okay, we're in. We're in. For some of you, it's been a long time since you've thought about the cross and you felt sort of that freedom, and so maybe in this moment, it's just a chance for you to be reminded of what God has done and see the cross as his demonstrated love for you, where worth and value are just breathed into your soul by the power of his Spirit. And just let God speak to you as we kind of declare this and consider this together this morning. So Father, I just ask that you would take what we have offered, what we have learned, and you would allow us to kind of wrestle through it, maybe later on, but in this moment, we would just hear you invite us to come, to respond, to return, to run to the relationship, that all the desires and longings we have that are so deep are actually met and fulfilled in what it is that you have made available to us. May we receive that fully. So God, I just ask you in these moments just to remind us, to speak to us, to love us by breathing worth and value into us. And I ask all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King.